Ja, herzlich willkommen, liebe Teilnehmerinnen und
Welcome to the participants to the home run of our Franco-German Energy Forum. The second part of the afternoon session is going to be about climate protection, economic growth and applications, the significance of hydrogen for the development of Europe. And I'd quite like to begin with an interesting panel, which is going to be talking about national strategies to achieve European targets and what is the role of hydrogen for decarbonisation and EU competitiveness, and what are the priority applications. And here we have some very different perspectives. We have the EU, Germany and France, all represented. Let me just tell you who the panelists are in alphabetical order. I'll begin with Dr. Alexander Lücke, who's Sub-Director General for Energy Security at the DG Economic Stabilization and Energy Security in Germany's Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. Welcome to Mr. Lücke. Then I will welcome Christophe Cassiotis, who is Chief of Staff to the DG for Energy and Climate in the French Ministry for Energy Transition. Welcome to you too. And then we have Hans van Steen, who has stepped in at short notice for Mechthild Wilsdorfer, whose name you see on the printed programme. Hans van Steen is a chief advisor at the European Commission, and I'd like to thank him for stepping in at such short notice. So I'd like to ask all three of you for your introductory statements on hydrogen strategies in the order EU, France, Germany. So, Mr. van Steen, you can kick the ball rolling.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Jean, for your introduction. And first of all, I would like, of course, to apologize from Mechthild Wilsdorfer, who had actually looked forward to this event, but her agenda suddenly made it impossible for her to attend, and she asked me to do so. So I'm very happy to be here. So for us in the EU, it's very, very clear that hydrogen is a key component of our energy and climate strategy, our quest to become climate neutral by 2050. All the analysis that we have made very clearly show that unless we manage to step up hydrogen, get significant hydrogen production, but also, of course, hydrogen use, especially in what we call the hard to abate sectors, industry, transport, we will simply not manage. So we are working full speed on making that happen. I think we've made good progress, for example, on the regulatory framework. We have now hydrogen as a key component of a lot of our funding programs as well. And indeed, we see a huge interest, not just in Germany and France, but really a big interest from across the EU in making this happen. So for us, this is absolutely essential. The current climate, economic, geopolitical, has not made it easier in recent months and now almost years. I think, though, if we're looking geopolitically, the events in Ukraine mean that there's an even stronger case for hydrogen, because a lot of the hydrogen, of course, is needed to replace gas, and we need to phase out gas from Russia completely. On that front, we've made very good progress, but there are still significant quantities of gas coming to the EU from Russia, and we need to get rid of that. Hydrogen is one way of doing it. There are many other ways, but we'll not go into that right now. Economically, we have seen a period of high inflations, which have made it much more difficult to get some of the good hydrogen projects that are in the pipeline in the EU off the ground. high electricity prices have also made it more complicated. So we are fully aware of all the challenges, and it's very clear that we need to solve them, and we need to solve them together. I don't know how much time I have, but I think I'll perhaps leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
The speaker's muted.
Exactement. Sorry, are you still muted?
I'm very sorry. This is the first time it happened today. Okay, ja, das tut mir sehr leid. Entschuldigung, ich habe hier ins Leere gesprochen. Vielen Dank, Herr Lücke. Genau.
I'm very sorry. I was talking into a vacuum. I just wanted to say, if you get the feeling that I'm keeping quiet for too long, then because we want to give the interpreters time to finish the sentence, is what I was just trying to say. But I do have a question to you, to Mr. Van Steen, about the EU strategy. How does the EU make decisions about which applications are to be covered by the hydrogen strategy? And how do you take account of different preferences on behalf of member states? They probably have different ideas about where their hydrogen priorities lie.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say the Commission, and I would say the EU, doesn't really decide about specific application of hydrogen. We have indicated what we see as priority sectors, and those were the ones that I mentioned, those where there are very few or indeed sometimes no other opportunities or options for decarbonization. This is things like aviation, it's things like shipping, certain types of industry that require very high temperatures. Those should really be the priorities. And that's what we think is important. And I also have a very clear impression that that view is shared widely among the member states. So we don't really see that member states have very different views on that particular point. What we see is that member states are in different stages of developing their hydrogen strategies or rolling out, so we say, the implementation of those strategies, and that's, I guess, quite normal. But on sort of specifically what is the role of hydrogen, I don't really see so much difference. We see, of course, differences when it comes to the different types of hydrogen. And perhaps I should have said that also in my introductory statement, that we from the Commission very strongly prioritize, so we say, renewable hydrogen, certainly low carbon hydrogen. Most of the hydrogen which we have on the market today and which is being produced and indeed consumed in the EU today is grey hydrogen coming from fossil fuels. And apart from the problems that this gives in terms of greenhouse gas performance and reduction, of course, it does not help us in reducing dependency on fossil fuels, which is another top priority for us. So our priority is very clearly on renewables from, or hydrogen from renewable sources of energy. And there, of course, a key challenge, and I don't know if we have time to talk about that, is to make sure that we have sufficient renewables available, especially renewable electricity, of course, to power the electrolyzers that is going to produce this green or renewable hydrogen. But I don't really see much differences in sort of the principles of where hydrogen can contribute.
Vielen Dank erstmal. Ja, die Frage der erneuerbaren Energien.
Thank you very much. We have touched several times today on the importance of renewables. Christophe Cassiotis, what is the French position on the hydrogen strategy?
Alors, notre stratégie hydrogène, elle a
Our French strategy has a great deal in common with the European strategy. Like that European strategy, it aims to focus on the hard-to-abate sectors. And our analysis is that we're actually already using a great deal of hydrogen in France and in Europe at present. 900,000 tons of fossil hydrogen are produced in France in refineries and also in the chemical sector. Now, the current fossil hydrogen is to be replaced by low carbon hydrogen that is produced using either renewables or nuclear energy. And then there's the question of new uses of hydrogen. This is an issue where there's a greater degree of uncertainty. We've identified two key sectors: decarbonisation of industry and decarbonisation of so-called heavy-duty mobility. We won't need to decarbonize our electrical system for several decades. We won't need hydrogen, for example, for the heating sector. So we focused on these sectors where there is no alternative. That's what we're focusing on. 6.5 gigawatts electrolysis is to be installed in France by 2030, producing around 600,000 tons of decarbonized hydrogen. So it's less than 900,000 tons that are currently produced and consumed, which is fossil hydrogen will only substitute part of that hydrogen, and new uses will emerge as well. So there will still be some grey hydrogen in 2030. The kind of application we've identified are 80% industrial uses and 20% is for heavy-duty mobility. So, for example, for HGVs and such likes, how do we arrive at that goal? One of the difficulties is that at present, there are no high power electrolyzers. We need to have high yield electrolyzers to cut the cost of production. We need to ensure that the entire production chain becomes more robust. That also goes for manufacturing, for components for the industry, so that will boost our energy sovereignty and our industrial sovereignty as well, producing components in Europe for this strategy. So there's the question of the goals that we have and the pathway to arrive there. That's vital, and that's what we try to address in our hydrogen strategy. We're well aware that the world has developed since we adopted our strategy in 2020. For example, there's the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been enacted in the US. There's the Chinese 5-year plan, which also raises questions about what we're doing in France and in Europe as a whole. Technology has also changed as well. On mobility, we see there's rapid ramp up of battery vehicles and even more heavy-duty vehicles than we had envisaged that will be operated with batteries in future. So we need to keep on updating our strategy, and that's what we're currently doing. That's parallel to our multi-annual energy strategy to clarify our objectives and to ensure that they're updated against this just international backdrop.
Thank you. And you've given me a cue there for my question to you. The mobility sector has been changing with a greater focus now on electrification, batteries, which means that this 80 to 20%, 80 industry, 20 mobility, if we look at the distribution of hydrogen, is that figure going to shift? Will it become 90 to 10? Or do you have an idea?
There's a particular mechanism, the territorial ecosystem. That's how we've supported rollout in the regions. It's mainly mobility schemes, for example, there are waste trucks and, for example, buses and such like. So these are all pathways that lead us to large-scale production. There's electrolyzers currently present. A 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt, just a few megawatts maximum. Now, for industry to glean experience, it's very important to assist this gradual ramp-up phase. In the longer term, we envisage much more widespread use of hydrogen, which means that there will be production linked to consumption on industrial sites. So there's a support mechanism that's currently being set up in France, focusing on this large-scale production. There's also going to be applications in refineries. For a long time, we looked at the question of whether it was really worth supporting such applications. Production, for example, of petrol will drop off as mobility becomes more electrified, but we don't have any misgivings any longer. The life cycle of electrolyzers is such that we will indeed need petrol in years to come, and the electrolyzers are in electrochemical sites. There's going to be incentives that we're setting up for this specifically in France now to support this. That's going to be our strategy moving forward.
Thank you. Alexander Lücke, we're looking forward to the German hydrogen strategy. Thank you very much, Ms. Rubner. Mr. Van Steen, Monsieur Cassioudis, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be taking part in this panel in context of questions about the ramp-up of hydrogen and the various strategies involved. Basically, I think it's a fine thing that we probably all totally agree about decarbonizing industry and many other sectors. We can only achieve that by deploying green or low-carbon hydrogen. And the German government has already taken many measures in relation with the national hydrogen strategy that was updated in July of this year by the cabinet. Perhaps just a couple of things that, in the wake of the ramp-up decision, we have decided to press ahead with, or have already done or will do. So one is to expand or develop the hydrogen backbone in Germany, our core network, so that we have a kind of motorway network in order to cover the various regions. We've also launched a procedure for carbon contracts for difference and made our first decisions on supporting IPCEI projects, for example, for steel manufacture. The first hydrogen has already arrived as a test at the port in Hamburg. Work on other points on implementing the strategy includes a Hydrogen Acceleration Act to simplify planning and permitting procedures for electrolyzers, pipelines, import to infrastructures. Some work has been done already for the LNG terminals. It won't be quite one-to-one the same, but in a similar way, we will be trying to provide appropriate infrastructure for the hydrogen ramp-up and to do that in a more accelerated manner. An important factor is increasing electrolysis capacity to at least 10 gigawatts by 2030. That will call for a huge effort. And then Germany is overwhelmingly, in the foreseeable future, going to be dependent on hydrogen imports, as with gas. We will be developing our hydrogen import strategy, formulating and adopting one, and that will look at where, how, and how diversified this should be, especially with a view to potential supplier countries and the form in which the hydrogen would be delivered. The carbon contracts for differences on the demand side are important, and I'd like to thank the Commission there for the provisional interim discussions about that. After a long discussion, we achieved a major milestone and are planning 8.8 gigawatts for new power stations that we're going to put out to tender. These will be operating from the outset on hydrogen, and by 2035, we want another 15 gigawatts of power plant capacity converted to hydrogen. And in addition to the law governing the expansion of a hydrogen backbone, we're already preparing a second phase for that, so that we can in the future have consistent, well-attuned planning for the future development of this network, together with the single market package and whatever's coming in that direction. This national hydrogen strategy, of course, establishes guidelines for the domestic framework, but the European framework is also important. And along with our colleagues from other member states, we'll be working with them because this single market for hydrogen will be essential to ensuring that Germany and Europe as a whole acquire enough hydrogen. But of course, an important factor there is the European Hydrogen Bank, with the options that that provides. For example, from our first experience with H2 Global, we know that this could be a very important component. Then our European hydrogen backbone as well. That's going to be particularly important for Germany, along with the H2 Med pipeline from France to Germany that we will continue to push. Well, that was just a rough overview of the measures that are underway at the moment at national level. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexander Lücke. I do have a brief question about your power plant strategy, which you mentioned. You say you've agreed on some parameters with the Commission. Can you tell us any details? You said 8.8 gigawatt new capacity, 15 gigawatt conversion. Are there any more specific ideas about when these calls for tender will occur or what locations you have your eye on? Yes, the call for tender is planned for 2024. And it's going to be launched fairly quickly, rolled out fairly soon, but we still have to put some finishing touches to it and prepare for the procedure based on the agreement that we already have. And those power stations in Germany are really envisaged for power storage to ensure supply in connection with the expansion of the renewables to ensure networks or grid stability. I hope this will all happen fairly fast so that the participating companies know fairly soon whether they can apply and to what extent. Thank you very much. Before we move into a discussion in the panel, let me just draw the participants' attention to their option for putting a question in the chat. This is our final discussion, and this is an opportunity, so be bold, put a question. I'd like to come back to the demand for hydrogen with our three panelists and how that's to be catered for. What role would be played by domestic generation or production, and what role by imports? And from your different perspectives, could you perhaps answer that question. Let's start. Hans van Steen, how does the Commission assess this overall European requirement in the future? And how do you see the European strategy to cater for that demand?
Thank you. I think here we can go back to the so-called Repower EU proposal, which was really the Commission's response to the new situation that we saw in Europe following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the need to phase out Russian fossil fuels, because that also meant that we needed to ramp up our production and use of hydrogen in the EU. And in that document that came out, I think in March of last year, we envisaged that there could be a 50-50 split between domestically produced hydrogen and hydrogen imported from third countries to the tune of 10 million tons produced in the EU and 10 million tons imported, and these numbers are by 2030. So in a relatively short space of time. And here we're talking again, and this is really important, about hydrogen from renewable sources of energy, which is so important because we really think that that is what needs to be promoted through that types of targets backed by national governments and certainly by the EU. Now, how does that square up with what we see happening on the ground? And the other picture is interesting because if we look at the plans for example, hydrogen production in the EU, including hydrogen from renewable sources, it's looking quite good because there are really many projects in the pipeline, as we say. This has nothing to do with gas or oil pipelines, but simply in the investment pipeline, there are a lot of projects, which is a very good thing. And also, again, shows the very strong interest that we see and how people are taking seriously the challenge of decarbonizing those sectors that I already referred to, which are really hard to see how we can decarbonize in other ways. That's a good thing. The not so good thing is that when we then actually compare with what is happening on the ground and how many of these projects are actually arriving at a final investment decision, the picture is very different. Still today, the proportion of hydrogen produced in the EU that comes from renewables is really very, very small. And there are many reasons for that. I already mentioned some of them. We think we can improve the overall context by creating clarity about the legal framework. Some of the points also mentioned by Dr. Lücke and Mr. Cassiotis, so that investors and industry have a very clear perspective of what is going to be the future market. Infrastructure is also very important. I think Dr. Lücke referred to the backbone. Again, we absolutely fully agree with that. That is why hydrogen is now part of the Trans-European Energy Networks program, and we will be selecting projects, hydrogen projects, also for the next so-called PCI list, projects of common European interest. These things are very basic requirements. Then we have created the bank, the hydrogen bank, which is not really a bank if we have to be very strict about it, but it's still an important financial instrument. And we are very advanced in getting the first round of projects channeled through this facility. I know that many people say that the funding which is available for the bank is too little. This is certainly what we hear from industry. It's 800 million euros, which is not very little, but of course it is little if you look at the overall investment needs, for example, to ramp up to the 10 million tons production in the EU. But we're hoping that this would sort of send a very clear signal and also make those projects bankable, so to speak. That means that we will probably have, we don't know, but one could imagine that we will have an oversubscription when it comes to this first round of the bank. But then we would have many interesting projects and hopefully good projects. And then I think those projects, we would look at how can they perhaps be financed also through public channels in different ways. And there, of course, there are other EU financing possibilities as well. The Recovery and Resilience Facility created to deal with the, so we say, post-COVID economic situation, which is, of course, many, many times bigger than what we have in the bank, is one very good example of that. And there could also be funding opportunities through national programs. And I think once we have the projects identified and they actually perform well in the comparative analysis that we will undertake when we see the response to the first auction under the Hydrogen Bank, we could then talk to member states also about these projects if they could be taken forward. But we're clear, I think, in what we say, that there are many, many challenges that need to be overcome, including, for example, on permitting requirements for new hydrogen facilities. We've had for many years a discussion about the very cumbersome and sometimes very lengthy procedures to get permissions to build new renewables projects. We've tried to deal with these through various parts of EU legislation, but we also see that in other areas. For example, when it comes to building electrolyzers and so on, they also have to go through a very sometimes complex process. This is addressed through the so-called NZIA, the Net Zero Industry Act, which is currently being discussed in the European Parliament and the Council. So a lot of challenges and a very complex situation that involves many, so we say, energy, climate, industrial aspects that needs to be tackled simultaneously if we are to be successful.
Dank für diese Perspektive auf die.
Thank you for this outlook and insight over the European hydrogen need and how to cover it. Christophe Cassiotis, so what is France's position on this? France has so far insisted on domestic hydrogen production. Could you give us the figures? And can you tell us how many imports you will see for the future?
There's one point that's important to explain. The 10 million ton goal is one where we disagree. We don't think that hydrogen will replace fossil fuels or natural gas. It'll only be used in certain sectors for decarbonisation. In particular, gas in the long term will be replaced by electricity, by energy-saving measures, by biomass for heating purposes, which are not high-temperature heating, and hydrogen will only be used for a small part. In 2030, there'll be significant demand for hydrogen. We'll need to work hard to make headway on that front of the 10 million tons. We think there's no certainty at this point in time, and hence we need to continue work on this to fine-tune information as to what's needed. Furthermore, we think there shouldn't be a priority for renewable hydrogen, but equal treatment on the basis of decarbonisation of hydrogen, provided that it's produced from non-fossil sources. That's important because then we can maximize production of hydrogen using our sources of low carbon electricity. And that will make it possible as well for us to prioritize production of electrolyzers. They're very expensive at present, and they need to have as long a life cycle as possible. That means that we're trying to maximize that kind of aspect. There's an important aspect for us is the percentage of projects that take FIDs, final investment decisions. That displays that our strategies are consistent. A few months ago, Bloomberg published a study showing that France is one of the countries in Europe where the percentage of projects that have got a final investment decision is actually highest. Almost 15% of total projects have an FID in France. And that does, to some extent, reflect the fact that our strategy is consistent. Looking to the longer term, a debate is underway as to whether there'll be a need for hydrogen imports. A study was published. The Fraunhofer Institute published it in August, the speaker corrects himself, published on the European Commission site, saying that Europe can produce enough renewable hydrogen in the light of its production capacity when it comes to production of renewables, that is. So hydrogen produced in Europe would necessarily be more expensive than hydrogen imports. So we think there needs to be a discussion among experts as to hydrogen imports. And the final word has not been said on that debate. Our strategy thus aims to resolve problems where there are difficulties. Hydrogen is extremely expensive. France invests almost 9 billion euros in its hydrogen strategy, and we want to do that in the areas where we think there's the most to be gained. So producing hydrogen close to large industrial sites, production of electrolyzers, fuel cells, and other storage means. With this 9 billion, we don't have the capacity to support large-scale transport infrastructure, which, furthermore, we don't think at this point in time are entirely justified. Of course, we're prepared to look into that as well. When it comes to the role of imports in France, we've got nothing against there being both imports and exports of hydrogen, as is the case in the current electricity system. Sometimes France exports electricity and vice versa. We import it too. Overall, though, we seek to satisfy our demand nationally over the year within France with domestic electricity production. And that overall is what will happen with hydrogen. We're quite happy to develop synergies between regions. There's Dunkirk, for example, we work together with Belgium and the Netherlands. There's the Grand Est region where we work with the Saar region, and we seek there to maximize production in these areas where hydrogen is consumed. Thank you.
Thank you. So a number of different political perspectives here. If I look at Germany, Alexander Lücke, we come a bit closer to the green perspective. The German demand for hydrogen, there are estimates in the new strategy or the updated hydrogen strategy. It already refers to 10 rather than 5 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity. That would mean, if one takes this green view, that the renewable energies need to be expanded accordingly. How will that work? Yes, in multiple ways, a combination of different things. One, of course, is that for 2030, we're assuming 90 watt to 130 terawatt hours of hydrogen that we're going to need, and we're not going to be able to produce that in Germany. As we've heard before, we're assuming that 50 to 70% will have to be imported. And the assumption is also that after 2030, we will probably even have to import more, depending how the market develops. So that means that both the expansion of the transmission networks for the imports, but also for the 50 to 30% of national production, will have to be speeded up. That means the renewables, and we've heard a number of references to this, the targets have been raised, that's been successful, and the power scenarios have been adjusted accordingly to take account of this additional requirement. What I was just saying is that we need to facilitate interim storage for power and make stable use of the renewables, and electrolyzer locations can be efficiently integrated if they are close to the generation locations. And something else that's important, and I know Mr. Cassiotis referred to this, as long as hydrogen is in short supply and expensive, electrification will be expected in certain segments. So up to 2030, we're assuming that hydrogen and its appropriate derivatives will be used for applications in industry and in mobility for heavy goods vehicles and in shipping and aviation. So it's only once hydrogen becomes cheaper that we'll be able to follow up with other segments. And that's going to take a while. So just briefly a question on that. It's come from the chat to Alexander Lücke. You were just talking about heavy goods transport. What about the fuels that are required? Methanol or e-kerosene? Will they be produced in Europe or even in Germany? Or will they be imported? So far, there's no set strategy. Other energy carriers will be involved. It'll probably be a mix. We need to see how the various industries convert, retrofit. There's no binding option there for who's going to get how much exactly. And I'd like to talk to the panel again about the distribution, the transportation of hydrogen. But there is a question in the chat that follows up on what you were just saying about demand and expansion. And this is a question to all of you. Are the hydrogen expansion targets geared to demand or technical potential? And if the demand can't quickly be catered for, how will priorities be set in meaningful ways for society as a whole? Who'd like to start? Is it demand or technology? I'm happy to carry on with that. Don't want to barge in, but the impression I have is that we see this thread right across the board with hydrogen, this chicken and egg question. So there are companies that would like to plan for hydrogen, but they don't know if they're going to get it. Whereas the system operators say, we'd love to provide hydrogen, but we don't know who wants it. So in Germany, we're assuming in our long-term scenarios that we will need to project demand and use that as an assumption and update that figure from now and then. And that's the basis that we're working from. But in addition to that, something that is a little more specific, I haven't yet seen. Any opinions on that from France and Brussels?
Well, I can come in if you allow me. Thank you. So I think what Dr. Lücke was saying about the chicken and egg is indeed exactly the issue here, that we will see that investments in production requires certainty for a demand. And this is one of the reasons why we have proposed, and it has now been agreed and adopted with the new Renewable Energy Directive, that there is a certain minimum level of these so-called RNFBOs, renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which includes different things, but there's a lot of hydrogen there, has to be a certain minimum share in order to meet the targets which are agreed within that directive. So that is, I would say, the demand side of things, where there is an obligation for member states to make sure that there is that type of demand developing, because otherwise we will continue to be, everybody will be waiting for everybody, which is really a very bad situation for all, and something that we cannot afford, because with the kind of deadlines and the urgencies that we have, especially on our climate agenda, there is no time for waiting. We simply cannot afford to have time where people who need to make really important investment decisions are waiting for others, and these people that they're waiting for are also waiting. So this is something that we are very, very aware of, and something that needs to be tackled. Can I just say one thing, maybe in relation to some of the points that were made about imports versus domestic production? We think that we will need imports, simply because the amounts of hydrogen that will be required. It's not like we say that, we need to have this 50-50, but that was the best we could come up with at the time. And of course, what matters here is also that we want the hydrogen to be produced where the potential for production is best. So we know that in certain parts of the world, there is a huge potential, a huge untapped potential for renewables, which can be used for hydrogen production. And we think it would be a shame to not look at how that can also help us produce in Europe. So for us, also looking at the situation with respect to future electricity demand in Europe, which is of course going to rise quite significantly due to overall electrification of our economies, electrification of transport, electrification of heating, especially through heat pumps. We have concerns that there would be sufficient, shall we say, renewable or certainly low carbon electricity available also for production of huge amounts of hydrogen. So that's a little bit the thinking behind that. We know this is challenging also for third countries to, shall we say, apply all the rules that we have, for example, in our delegated act, which some of you may be familiar with, which is basically saying out what can be considered to be renewable hydrogen. But it is necessary to apply those rules, obviously, also in third countries. If not, we will simply have something which is not a level playing field, and that is not really acceptable. So that was just a remark on that point. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wir haben nicht mehr viel
Thank you very much. We don't have much time left, so I'd like to ask Christoph Cassiotis about
infrastructure. So the question was, how can hydrogen be produced in Europe and distributed in Europe and in individual countries? And in particular, I'd like to hear France's stance on this issue because of the feasibility study for the pipeline H2Med, where France will contribute. So is it in France's interest, or how large is France's interest in the feasibility of this pipeline?
We have a clear strategy for infrastructure. In the first instance, we want to develop that for specific regions, linking production to consumption and storage, and then try to link up these areas to try to optimize the cost of production, the cost of consumption, and little by little to cut the cost of hydrogen for end users. So at the end of the day, we'll have an overall system based on these interlinked areas. So with most grids, that's what happened. People started producing links on a smaller scale before creating larger scale links. As to Mar, for example, that is of interest in a context in which France and Spain do support development of renewable low carbon hydrogen at the European level, because this pipeline can be deployed for renewable and for low carbon hydrogen. So both can go through this pipeline. It made it possible to link Barcelona and Marseille, where there will be industrial demand, and possibly also for decarbonisation of the maritime sector. There's Manosque, where there's going to be storage of hydrogen in salt caverns. That's what's planned anyway. So it's an interesting project. It's part of an overall approach. So there's support to renewable hydrogen and for low carbon hydrogen to maximize production thereof for this pipeline. And that is what we need to keep on appraising to make sure that it does make sense in technical and economic terms in the years to come. And that brings me to the question of the kind of hydrogen imports we might look at. If you look at the uses of hydrogen in the years to come, there's direct use of hydrogen in industry on the one hand. Plus, there's a lot of debate on synthetic fuels, particularly SAF in the longer term. Synthetic aviation fuels are being discussed in the longer term. If you want to substitute some aviation fuels or indeed shipping fuels by hydrogen, we need a great deal of energy. That might mean that it's difficult to close the loop with electricity in the longer term. But we're looking for France around 2040, certainly after 2040, even running up to 2050. At that point in time, there may be a need for import, but for import of fuel, with part of these synthetic fuels being produced in Europe and some being produced in other countries and then imported directly via existing infrastructures. We do import most of our fuels into Europe, so it's not necessarily linked directly to the question of infrastructure. People think that that's, when we look at the scale of the infrastructure, we need to look at the type of product to be imported. You could also envisage reduced iron or ammonia being imported. Ammonia could be used directly in fertilizers. It's easier to import those than for hydrogen. It could be lower cost and would have a direct impact on the scale of infrastructure needed. There's a lot of uncertainty that we need to overcome before we have a clear idea as to the scale.
Thank you. Alexander Lücke, Germany will be taking part in H2Med. The question is, how acceptable is this in Germany, these new networks? We don't have such positive experience as far as expanding power grids is concerned. Can we transpose that experience to a new hydrogen network? And perhaps just briefly, how much of the existing gas network can we perhaps use for the hydrogen network? Well, the popularity or acceptance for the pipeline relates to the question how quickly hydrogen can be ramped up. This is a fundamental issue where the German Chancellor recently marked this as, flagged it as an important issue, and said that we need to step up all these procedures so that important procedures can be wrapped up quickly. That doesn't mean necessarily that tried and tested schemes have to be set aside, including the involvement of local residents and, of course, environmental impact assessments and so forth. We already have acceleration mechanisms that take that on board, but I think we have to recognize that if we want to achieve similarly fast progress on this front, we need to look at ways of doing that. But it has to be clear to everyone that if we, because of our climate targets, really have to take urgent action, then we will need that hydrogen network very quickly. That means, and current draft legislation includes this, that we define a public interest. We have to say under what circumstances, how long does it take, and so forth. But it needs to be recognized, and I think it is recognized by the public at large, that in many cases, not in all cases, this would take priority over particular interests. What I was describing with the network itself, our backbone, our German core network, that has been designed on the basis of work that's criteria that have been drawn up together with the system operators, local industry, companies, so that we know where the hydrogen, or can assume where the need for hydrogen will be greatest. And then there are also long-term scenarios where we can look to see how much pipeline we need, where does it need to go to, what volumes are we talking about. And Mr. van Steen talked about the European requirements, which we also have to meet. And then we need cross-border interconnections. H2Med was mentioned in Southern Europe, the pipelines involved there. These are things I think everyone's aware of and has to be aware of. But as far as the existing gas infrastructure is concerned, we're assuming that much of this can be rededicated and used for hydrogen. We're going to need some new build. We know how expensive that is. But the statements we're getting so far from the system operations and also from the Energy Network Agency suggests that much of the current motorway network can be reused for this future network. So I don't think we'll need to accelerate the expansion on that level. Thank you. Just to conclude, I'd like to hear something about the financing instruments, because that is for the hydrogen economy. And let me ask Christophe Cassiotis, because in France, we're seeing an interesting trend. The French, or the Minister for Energy Transition in France, recently announced 4 billion support for carbon contracts for difference. And these additional costs for generating hydrogen from electrolysis, compared with fossil fuel generation would be compensated on that basis. Can you tell us to what extent these contracts have been designed or are ready to go?
Yes, it's to ensure that there's larger scale production of hydrogen. The aim is to reduce the risk with the producer of this kind of low carbon hydrogen. The idea is the following. Aid is to be provided, and that will vary on the basis of the price of fossil gas and the price of carbon emissions, and on the basis of the price of electricity. So we'll be looking at the development of these various parameters. It's for a period of 12 to 15 years. It'll be a competitive system for like at least 70% of the cost. That idea will be that we'll use public funds as well as possible. It'll be phased in. There's 3 phases in the 3 years to come, and they will increase little by little. It's aimed at providing support to production of hydrogen, which is to be used in industry and solely in industry, and also for consumers who are located in France. For the mobility sector, there are other support mechanisms that are in place. So there's a special tax on that front. So that's the broad structure of this, and it will also boost production of both renewable and low carbon hydrogen produced from electricity that is generated from nuclear energy. That will be good for both the capex and the opex of those in the sector. Furthermore, the DG Climate of the European Commission has told us that this can slot in to this system of the European Hydrogen Bank. So that means that if renewable energy, hydrogen is produced, an application will be made to the European Hydrogen Bank, while the low carbon hydrogen part can be supported by the French mechanism.
Thank you. And financing instruments, I'd like to hear from Hans van Steen a bit more from the Commission about that. How do you see the development of these important projects of common European interest, these IPCEI projects? There could be these final investment decisions. We need more of them to be achieved for hydrogen projects. How can these uncertainties that always accompany such decisions be reduced by the Commission?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I've already talked a bit about the issues with financing. And of course, what we hear from industry is that sometimes they feel that it takes too long to get an answer from the Commission, that the procedures are too complex and complicated, and they compare themselves with the situation in the US, with the IRA, and we see that. We are trying our very best to speed up processes as far as possible. On the other hand, there are also very important checks to be made by us before we can approve projects in this. Now, for the IPCEI specifically, we've already approved 2 batches of projects. The first one was 41 projects in 15 different EU member states, which would repeat up to 5.4 billion euros in public funding. And then, of course, our expectation is that this public funding will also lead to a very significant private investment. And then later on, we've also had, this was in July of last year, we've also had a second batch of projects agreed, which concerned another 35 projects with more or less the same amount of public funding. And again, we would expect that to lead to a lot of private investments as well. Now, we of course would like to give more money to projects to get them over the finishing line in order for them to conclude their FIDs. But of course, we are operating also within the general EU budget, and there are many other priorities, as you are certainly all aware. But I think it is very clear that in recent years, hydrogen has moved up the agenda very, very much, and is now actually able to get funding from a lot of different sources. And I've mentioned some of them, including the recovery and resilience facilities, which is, of course, a very, very big amounts of money. And a lot of that goes into the clean energy transition, or the energy transition more generally. And that is absolutely essential, because we believe that these are projects that will not only help us towards our objectives on climate neutrality, but will also actually create a lot of economic growth and prosperity. So we do push as much as we can, but many different conflicting interests at play here, of course. I think that's what I can say on the IPCEIs more specifically. This is not handled so much by us, but more our colleagues in DG GROW, as you know. But of course, we work very closely across the different services in the Commission to make sure that we are all trying to pursue the same agreed objectives, including on hydrogen.
Mhm. Vielen Dank. Eine letzte Frage noch, Alexander.
Thank you. A last question, Alexander Lücke. So there is this future image of a hydrogen network in Germany with consumption hubs. How sure are the planners and the politicians about the location of these consumption hubs? And how great is the risk that in the end we might end up with stranded assets and write-offs? Can you say anything about that? We're trying to contain that risk. We can't completely rule it out, of course, ever, by working in a very close process with the TSOs and the Federal Network Agency on the criteria for regions and companies that ought to be linked into the network. That's partly the IPCEIs, that is the projects, then the PCIs, once we have those, certain branches of industry where it's absolutely clear that they are going to depend on hydrogen because there is no real alternative for them, then the cross-border points of import, the interconnections, and then power stations that have been working on a CHP basis, where we can assume that in the future they're still going to be needed. And a few other factors too, but those are key ones. And all of this underpinned by long-term scenarios about expectations of hydrogen demand. And on that basis, in the middle of this year, the TSOs submitted an initial draft for a network. There were hearings, so other operators were heard, but also companies, industrial associations, other stakeholders had an opportunity to express their views on this, which ensured a certain feedback as to whether this planning was running completely down the garden path or not. Of course, there's no certainty, but at least in terms of company planning and the planning of the TSOs and the agency, does take this into account. This network plan drawn up by the TSOs is, once it has been finalized in legal terms, it will be reviewed by the network agency to see how realistic it is. And another point is, of course, again, that the state, and we'll have to see how, that there'll be a kind of depreciation model so that for those TSOs that will then have to build that network, probably in the next few months, if the Bundestag Parliament adopts this, then when pipelines have to be implemented bit by bit until 2030, given these imponderables about the ramp-up of hydrogen, the state will probably have to provide a certain guarantee, a buffer, in order to prevent these stranded assets. Thank you. And now I'm getting permission for one last question here. And the last question goes to France. Christophe Cassiotis. The European Commission in 2023 commissioned a study, which you mentioned before, in which France is named as the greatest hydrogen producer in Europe in the year 2050 in this cost-optimized system. Germany, by that point, the assumption is there will be no production of hydrogen at all. Can you tell us a little about how this was received in France?
I don't think that the general public read it. I think it was highly technical, actually, and was targeted at experts. I think that the key point that we need to emphasize here is that there is no consensus on this topic in scientific terms. There is this study. There are other studies that have been produced by Finnish universities showing Europe's capacity to produce enough hydrogen at a competitive price to meet its needs. Studies have been done by other bodies showing that the objectives are perhaps too objective in the light of willingness of industrialists to change their instruments over the next few years in order to work with hydrogen. So the crux of the matter is that there is uncertainty that should not stand in our way in moving ahead in areas where we think that we can certainly progress without worrying about the issues or having regrets subsequently. There are areas where it's quite clear that we can move ahead. There are areas which are hard to abate where we'll have to substitute hydrogen to attain our environmental goals. It's this ramp up on clearly identified sites with clearly identified goals that will make it possible for us to cut production costs by scaling up production also for hydrogen and electrolyzers. So we really need to forge ahead step by step, avoiding stranded assets and getting the most out of public funding.
Well, I'd like to thank the three panelists, Alexander Lücke, Christophe Cassiotis, and Hans van Steen, for this very interesting discussion from a political perspective from Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. And we could have continued for a long time, but we are now on our home run. So we have Dr. Franco-German from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and he is head of energy transition, this team at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and he's also a contributing author of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. And I am very happy to hear him and his outlook on the situation. Well, thank you for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be among you. I think it's been a very interesting day, and it's up to me now to wind it up. I've been asked to focus on the most important applications of hydrogen from a scientific point of view. And I'll be saying something about hydrogen and its significance from a systemic point of view. Above all, I'm going to look at this concept keystone of decarbonisation and look to see how meaningful that concept is. I'll also be mentioning some specific figures that we have in the flagship scenario of the International Energy Agency in its zero emission scenario for 2050. This IEA scenario fits quite well with the modeling that we've been doing at our institute in Potsdam, where we feed into the IPCC reports. Overall, you might like to see my presentation as an appeal for research into hydrogen scenarios. This needs to be considered more greatly in the public debate. So I'm looking at a consensus here. Let's start by looking at the significance of hydrogen. We're all aware that hydrogen is an essential component of the energy transition. It's above all necessary because it is indispensable or almost indispensable in so many applications where the value of it's where there is no alternative that the value of this expensive hydrogen is most obvious. This indispensability is reflected in a big willingness to pay. There are 6 applications here in 3 sectors. Let's start with industry. And here above all, the primary sector. Above all, in industrial countries, there's going to be a breakthrough to green steel during this decade with the help of direct reduction methods or reduction. The energy transition is already talking about steel as a fast-to-abate and not a hard-to-abate sector. I share that optimism, although I'm a bit more cautious about it, especially if we look at India, China, and the global situation and medium-term potential for carbon capture and storage. But it's clear that this primary steel sector has a huge demand or can trigger a huge demand for hydrogen and be an anchor point for infrastructure. And this can be translated into investment certainty for the supply side of hydrogen. The second application in industry is ammonia. It's very clear that we need hydrogen here. We need it as molecule. And the question is much more, where will we transform the ammonia? How much will we transform in Europe, in different countries like Germany, and how much will we import? Ammonia is easy to import because it can be transported by ship. There is a global ammonia market, and I think it's very likely that in the 2030s, we will witness a global market for green and blue ammonia. This ammonia will primarily be used in industry for producing fertilizer. It's less certain to what extent ammonia will really be used as a transport vector for hydrogen itself, to what extent we can crack ammonia. It's good that we are exploring the shipping options here, even if this is perhaps less competitive than delivery through European pipelines. But before 2030, we can already realize some volume of import. I do understand this exploring of shipping or maritime import as a kind of guarantee, as a kind of buffer, if there's a delay to the European pipelines. The third application in industry is petrochemicals. So above all, plastics production. There are huge volumes of hydrogen and carbon that will be required there, but there are very different ways for closing those loops in the chemicals industry, either by recycling a great deal or by importing green methanol to reduce that requirement in the industrial countries. But we're still going to have that demand will remain substantial. We'll come on to the next sector, which is mobility. Here, hydrogen, above all, plays a role in aviation and shipping, it's very probable that we will have a global e-fuel market in the 2030s for shipping. At the moment, the announcements are relatively few and far between. The final investment decisions are even more uncertain. But in the 2030s to 2040s, there will be a market for green methanol and for e-fuels, because unlike hydrogen, carbon, that is e-fuels, can easily be transported by ship. The sixth application is as a seasonal interim storage for power. And this is a figure from the International Energy Agency. The proportion of this power, if we achieve net zero in 2050, is 89%. Most of that power will come from, that renewable energy will come from wind and solar, where we have a lot of fluctuation. And hydrogen as a storage medium is the best candidate for countries pursuing this pathway for achieving a completely renewable electricity system, ecosystem. So there are huge volumes here where there is an absolutely essential demand for hydrogen. It's an essential component. To what extent is it a keystone? I would say it makes sense to talk about a keystone, but we need to not misunderstand that term. In two senses, it makes sense to talk about a keystone. Firstly, in terms of volume, because we're still at the very beginning of this pathway. It's going to be a huge challenge to establish this new energy form. Even with exponential growth, we expect a great shortage. And because the demand in the no-regret sector, where it's absolutely indispensable, is huge, but also because there will be limits to growth. So we certainly expect that hydrogen and e-fuels will be in short supply, and that consumers will not only have to pay the costs, but also a premium for shortage. Secondly, hydrogen, compared with other options, is an expensive option for climate protection and will remain an expensive option. Even if we see dramatic falls in costs, hydrogen and e-fuels will probably remain more expensive than most of the alternatives, above all direct electrification, and will be more expensive than the fossil fuels. It doesn't matter, because in the long term, we will have carbon pricing. But because of the costs, there is this great uncertainty when it comes to investment. Now, we can start pointing our fingers at the politicians who have designed all these financial instruments but haven't implemented them yet. But at the same time, it is fundamentally due to the physicality. These long-term costs are going to remain for a long time, and that's why it's a keystone, the final stone at the top of the building. And if we look at the scenario of the International Energy Agency, the percentage of end consumption of hydrogen and e-fuels in 2050, when we have net zero, in that scenario, which is an ambitious scenario, the proportion of hydrogen and e-fuels will be 8% globally. That's 7% for Europe. That means that the greatest proportion in abatement measures will come from the renewables, from wind, solar, and direct electrification, and that its use across all sectors. The contribution for hydrogen in buildings in 2050 in this scenario has been adjusted from 2% in the original version of the scenario 2 years ago to 0 in the latest version. The use for e-vehicles is similar, and our global scenarios show a similar picture. We have many scenario studies that have been calculated for Germany, and they show a similar picture. So where the political debate and the public debate is loudest, That's where the science is clearest. Hydrogen is not so transformational in the transport sector. It's conservative in structural terms, and it makes a conservative promise that in the end cannot be kept. So the significance in the debate about hydrogen needs to calm down. It needs to become more objective. People's expectations need to be more realistic. So the diversity of hydrogen should not be misunderstood. The transformation to electric vehicles should not be delayed. And these options have their own hurdles, but those can be surmounted. We don't need to use hydrogen to project our illusory solutions for those problems. There are a couple of things I haven't mentioned yet, 2 sectors where hydrogen will play a role, probably, but where hydrogen is not indispensable, where there's an even greater uncertainty about the specific contribution it can make. One is process heat in industry, where we don't need hydrogen as a molecule, but we need it to produce heat. Basically, all process heat can be directly electrified, and in most cases that will be better value for money. That often means intervening deeply in the processes, but that can be advantageous if hydrogen can provide advantages if it's available. And then there's heavy goods transport, the trucks, especially the long-haul trucks. Here we're seeing increasingly the insight that hydrogen does better than electric batteries here. And the International Energy Agency has also adjusted its statistics on this compared with the last report. It's still open, but hydrogen is bound to play a role in the HGV long-haul sector. Both of those sectors are very dependent on infrastructural decisions relating to charging stations and hydrogen charging. That will depend partly on the EU, but also the international framework, and above all, the framework between France and Germany at the center of the EU is going to play a big part there. Now, the last part of what I wanted to say, this term keystone should not be misunderstood. Hydrogen needs to be developed now, and we need to take the long view. We can't expect substantial contributions before 2030. But the very fact that there is indispensable demand means that in the long term, these will be huge markets. We're looking now at 1 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity. The IEA scenario is looking at 30,000 in 2050. That's a huge growth rate. And for that, we will need huge quantities of renewable energy or climate neutral. That is 50,000 terawatt hours, which is and that is just for hydrogen. If we get the framework right, then where hydrogen and e-fuels make sense in a systemic framework, there will be a number of opportunities there. I think I can see 5 points that will be important for a meaningful climate policy. Firstly, we're going to need common, coordinated target goals. It'll make sense to have a direct relationship with scientific studies and the International Energy Agency in order to base decisions on scenarios. And those scenarios need to be regularly renewed, updated, in order to capture changes that are taking place. Secondly, the supply needs to be related to demand and choose the right anchor points. Thirdly, the supply side can be subsidized through the European Hydrogen Bank, and the infrastructure can also be subsidized, or financial risks can be taken on by the state. But it's most important that at the same time, priorities are set for the use of this subsidized hydrogen. So a demand pool needs to be generated that will be translated into investment certainty. Sectoral quotas are a very good approach here. 42% of the hydrogen used in the EU should in 2030 be RFNBOs, so green hydrogen basically. That will place industry under huge pressure to respond and will result in more investment certainty. And similar in 2030 with e-fuel quotas in aviation and shipping. And the carbon contracts for differences for industry could also trigger a demand pool for steel, for example. And we need to respect where hydrogen will not play a role and steer the transition towards, for example, e-cars. And a last thought, if the politicians don't manage to make these instruments more technology specific or sector specific, or if clear lines are not drawn, then another indispensable instrument will become even more important, and that is ambitious carbon pricing with compensation for social hardship. In all sectors, efforts are going to have to be made if hydrogen is in the long term to be competitive. And high carbon pricing would make sure the hydrogen gets to where it makes the most sense. But this high carbon price needs to be, it needs to take the political strain. If we look at the ETS figures, for example, the price could grow considerably. We need to take that political strain because that will create the competitiveness and the certainty, that kind of political commitment. And France and Germany will play a key role in, if they can coordinate that towards an ambitious carbon price, they will need to be resilient on that front. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. This was a very excellent conclusion here. It's a political plea. And of course, as a coordinator here, I'm very thankful and grateful because it's usually my job to conclude and to give a summary. And you did that for me. Thank you. And thank you also for the outlook into the future. Now, I would like to thank everybody on behalf of the whole team and the organizers. I would like to convey the thanks of the Franco-German Energy Transition Office, the German Ministry for Energy and Climate Action, the French Ministry for Energy Transition, and the German Foreign Office. They all thank the speakers for their participation in this conference. And we would also like to thank the interpreters, Nathalie Pijolet, Claire Locher, Simone Hess, Helen Ferguson, Kate Vanovich, and Ingrid Berman. Thank you very much for the good job you did. I would like to point out to you that all presentations and video streams will be online from the beginning of next week onwards on our website, and you will also receive a summary by email. And I would not like to conclude without mentioning the 17th of October, where we will be having a webinar on energy transition in local communities. It's about local acceptance and financial participation. On the 15th of November, a conference in Berlin on wind parks, and on the 29th of November, an online conference on photovoltaics and own consumption in commercial and industrial sectors. We also have our current publications. We call them Espresso, so it's just one leaflet and in French. It is on the German hydrogen strategy. We also have an Espresso in French on the German Energy Act, and we also have a paper on financing possibilities in wind plants in Germany and France. So we have many, many resources for our common Franco-German energy future. I'd like to thank you all for your interest in this conference, and I wish you all a nice evening and enjoy the knowledge you gained here. Goodbye.